But anyway, there was this move towards dynasties, even in elected republics. And the failure of all these regimes and the ongoing pain and suffering of the Palestinian people that was never lifted. And of course, you must understand the impact of the refugees on the region and on all the neighboring states. Here in Europe, you're terrified if there are, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 refugees. How about hundreds of thousands of dispossessed refugees suddenly descending on a third world country already impoverished? What kind of economic, demographic, social, and political impact would that have on that country? This is what happened in Jordan, in Lebanon, primarily in Lebanon, Syria, a bit in Egypt, and so on. So the Palestinian refugees also formed a major force for the Arab regimes to think that if this conflict is not resolved, if the Palestinian question is not solved, these refugees are going to constantly form a focal point for discontent and instability domestically within their own areas. That's why, let's say in Lebanon, for example, the refugees were treated with such total injustice and oppression. They were totally deprived of any civil right, including the right to work, the right to education, the right to build, and so on, and the right to travel, because you had stateless IDs, so you couldn't move. Anyway, so this, plus the ongoing pain of the refugees, increasingly contributed to the radicalization of public opinion, and the regimes were aware of that. And radicalization not towards the left, because of the failure of nationalists, Arab nationalism and so on, could not win a war and could not make peace. The Arab nationalists who were, calling for the liberation of Palestine lost to Israel. And Israel, of course, had the strongest army in the region, the fourth strongest army in the world. And at the same time, they could not make a just peace to end the occupation. So they couldn't do either. And the public was becoming quite angry and motivated against these regimes. So they didn't move to the left. They moved to the right. They moved more towards the religious, political Islam, more towards the right-wing radicalization. A gradual shift was taking place away from the largely secular nationalists and towards radical Islam, threatening the overthrow of existing governments. Not so much by military or violent means. Remember, in Iran, there was a violent revolution, and it's not an Arab country, but in 1978-79, the Shah was removed. He was the best friend of the West. And suddenly the people who took over, violently overthrown, the people who took over were radical Islam. But now it was more and more by the ballot box, as happened in Algeria, for example, and lately in Palestine with the Hamas takeover. This was the first time in which the Muslim Brotherhood and an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood won elections through power through elections, and that's why they're holding on to power. They don't want to relinquish power. Now, since 1991 and the Madrid process, the main thrust of Arab diplomacy was directed towards peacemaking by ending the occupation, culminating in 2002 with what is called the Arab Peace Initiative that was revived in 2005-2006 when the situation became extremely intolerable. The Arabs in Madrid declared that peace was a strategic option. We said, fine, if peace is a strategic option, how do you propose to make it happen? You cannot just sit back and say we have a strategic option, which is peace. And at the same time, peace is like dancing. You need a partner. It's nice to dance alone, but you cannot force Israel to make peace if you are sitting back and saying it is our option. But anyway, the Arab initiative stayed an initiative, hibernated for a long time until the situation deteriorated and we in Palestine were on the brink of a real civil war, which we, of course, entered into later. And then I talked last time about the Mecca Agreement. I don't want to go into more detail. Now, the failure of the Oslo process and the consequences of the two wars on Iraq, and before that the Iraq-Iran war, polarized the Arab world even further. In Palestine, the failure of the Camp David talks between the Palestinians and Yasser Arafat and Barak, who's now defense minister in Israel, Sharon's incursion into Haram al-Sharif, and the breakout of the second Intifada in September 2000, plus Israel's extreme measures and the violent escalation and siege, also contributed altogether to the disillusionment of the public with the discourse of peace and moderation, and generated enormous support for the more radical Islamist factions or parties. Iran was seen as the patron of radical Islam, especially as a sponsor of Hezbollah through Syria and later Hamas. And of course, that destroys or exposes the fallacy that there's a Shiite axis as opposed to a Sunni axis, because it had nothing to do with religion, it was a political tool. In this context, it was convenient for the Bush administration, especially post-September 11, 2001, to divide the region into axis of extremists and an alliance of moderates. Or they call them the quartet of moderates, which again, typical of American foreign policy, is quite simplistic and not entirely true. Decidedly, the US so-called war on terrorism had a major devastating impact on the region. I don't think we can overestimate the impact of September 11 on the whole world, but on our region in particular. Not only did this war on terrorism place the Arab world on notice, the Arab regimes, on the defensive against the terrorism charge. We were all guilty. We were all terrorists, regardless whether you're Christian or Muslim, Arab or non-Arab. The whole region was guilty. It unleashed further forces of violence and extremism, and also generated further non-state actors, particularly as a disastrous consequence of the war on Iraq. Iraq is a country that is being fragmented, dismantled by war. And it's become the headquarters for any extremist, any violent group, any militia that wants to fight Americans. I mean, it's generated more extremism, violence, terrorism, radicalism than you can think of, and unleashed it on the whole region. It also enhanced the power of non-Arab states in the region. It destroyed a very intricate balance, namely Iran and Turkey. Not so much Turkey, because Turkey is facing problems in northern Iraq with the Kurds, but primarily in Israel. The war ultimately served Israel's interests, and Israel now felt empowered that the US carried out its war on its behalf, destroyed the strongest country in the region, and now, at the crosshairs, we see Israel focusing on Iran. We will talk about this. If you want to see what happens to American policy, listen to what Israel says. Read Israeli political discourse, newspapers, and so on, and you'll see it suddenly becoming American policy. For years, we were talking about the targeting of Iraq, and we said a war against Iraq is looming. And everybody said, no, 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 that's impossible. But then Iraq, of course, gave them the excuse by invading Kuwait, which was something that should not have happened. But anyway, the global ramifications of America's war on terrorism were quite significant in many ways. One, it was a blatant violation of civil and human rights within the US, domestically. Remember the Patriot Act that the US passed, the violation of human rights and civil rights and so on. And of course, not so domestically, what happened in Abu Ghraib prison and Guantanamo and so on. So these provided the rationalization and the model for anybody who wants to violate the law. All the third world countries that wanted to do whatever they wanted anyway, all autocratic dictatorial regimes had the perfect model in the US. If the US can have the Patriot Act, so can we. If they can carry out racial identification, so can we, racial profiling. If they can torture prisoners, why can't we? Two, it increased the transatlantic divide between, of course, the US and Europe, rather than the alliance. and divided Europe in many ways, those who sided with the US and those who didn't, and you all know about that. And of course, people like Donald Rumsfeld, I'm glad he's no longer in office, but he's the one who decided to coin Old Europe and New Europe. And he decided New Europe is the Europe that will side with the Americans no matter what. That, again, is an oversimplification of reality another way. 3, the unholy alliance between the Christian right, the radical Christians in the US, and they're a very destructive force, and the neoconservatives redefined global relations as well as the domestic agenda. They took over foreign policy in the US, not just domestically, but internationally. They led to the disengagement from the Palestinian-Israeli issue, abrogation of responsibility, gave Israel a free hand, time and space to escalate, to continue to use violence. I mean, we were people who were under occupation, who were reoccupied, who were under siege and being shelled. I can give you horror stories in my house for hours if you want, what happened when they blew up the Muqata across the street from my house, how they destroyed all the electricity poles, the roads, the trees even. We lived without electricity, without water, without phones for some 40-some days. Anyway, but they kept their distance. They prevented the US from engaging in any way positively, from launching any kind of peace initiative, and they created a political vacuum which generated more violence, more desperation, and therefore more extremism, this war on terrorism. It also showed that the policies of the broader Middle East, I talked about this last time, the failed policies of the broader Middle East, the greater Middle East, the new Middle East, the externally imposed democratic reforms, rather than authentic, homegrown democratic reforms or endeavors, while they decided to avoid the long-standing grievances, the injustices, the causes of conflict and instability, at the forefront of which is the Israeli occupation of Arab and particularly Palestinian land. They decided to ignore all these issues and focused on a freedom deficit. And I told them, because the freedom deficit is not the freedom of women, it's not, the freedom deficit is the freedom of the Palestinian people that is being robbed, that is being destroyed by the Israeli occupation. But also we saw in this unholy alliance the rise of absolutism and ideology. And whenever you have positions of ideological impact coming from the US, whether based on biblical exegesis or revelation or whatever, or whether based on hardline extreme right-wing policies to the right of Netanyahu, they fed their counterparts. All extremism, whether in Christianity or Islam or Judaism, when you maintain a monopoly on God and you think you have divine right and a direct discourse, then you will do whatever is possible, whatever you can do, and you can justify it because God gave you the mandate, not the people who elected you. And when you have a divine right, then it means you will never resolve the question. You will never resolve any conflict because that's a fight to the finish. You don't compromise. God has absolute power. It also generated this view of the polarization and the Manichaean universe. Remember, good versus evil. It was very simple now. The world, we went back to being children when there was nothing but good and evil, God and the devil. There was nothing in between. Angels and devils. You're either with us or against us. Now, why can't I be at a distance from you and critical? Why do I have to be either your enemy or your best friend? Anyway. All the nuances and complexities of cultural, political, national, global definitions and relations were blurred or ignored or oversimplified. And of course, we had the resurgence of the clash of civilizations. I'm sure many of you have read Huntington. I don't need to repeat that. But one thing that was very important that Israel also emulated was militarism, unilateralism, and the strategic doctrine of preemptive strikes. Focus on Iraq and Iran, and we shall see what's happening with Iran later.